So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone who's joining. Um, these are not fun topics to talk about, but I think they're really important and really fascinating topics to talk about, and I hope you all will agree. Um, I kind of came to this research in a twisty, turny way. I always knew that I was interested in the study of media, which was why I did film studies as an undergraduate. And in my department, we were looking at films quite, from a critical and analytical standpoint. And I knew I really loved doing that, but I also was kind of interested, I realized, in new media, which we weren't really talking about much in my department at the time. So
anything, please.
At the time,
it's playing.
At the time, I was really interested in YouTube. This was kind of in YouTube's earlier days, when the big thing was viral videos, and everyone was talking about, oh, YouTube viral videos. And so I wrote my senior undergraduate thesis on YouTube viral videos, and started to become interested in social science through that, where you're analyzing empirical data and kind of moving from a critical humanities standpoint to a social science standpoint. From there, out of undergrad, I actually went to work for a company that did social media analytics on behalf of brands and ad agencies. And so I started to look more at social media and new media from a business perspective. And then from there went on to do my master's, where I was finally able to start looking at what I realized was kind of what I had been particularly interested in, which was political content online. The way I came to the far right specifically is a bit of an accident. I got hired for a team at the Research Institute, Data and Society. And at that point, they were building up a team to look at far right content online. And I found myself kind of, it was kind of like squishing a spider or something. It was awful, but I couldn't quite look away. And found that I was just continued to be really fascinated by it, and basically have continued to research it to this day. I think, unfortunately, it is a really big problem in our time. And because the internet is presenting so many new challenges for us, there's no shortage of ways to start kind of exploring and looking at what's actually going on. So the challenge continues.
Great, thanks. Why don't you just, I think everybody's kind of waiting for you to start. Can't wait.
Great, sounds good. Okay, so with that in mind, I will launch in. So before I do launch in, I just want to give a quick heads up that because of the nature of my research, I'm going to be discussing some disturbing and bigoted ideas today. So I just wanted to give people that little warning ahead of time. I've spent, since joining the team at Data and Society, I've spent the past several years conducting empirical research on white supremacist and male supremacist communities online, and specifically on the digital media that they produce. And frequently I've focused on the way that propaganda and disinformation are produced and disseminated on YouTube specifically. Although, as we'll see, as I talk about it, we'll see how a lot of content kind of flows between channels. When I tell people that I research far-right content on YouTube, though, I usually get some version of the same response. People say they've heard that the YouTube recommendation algorithm is drawing people in to rabbit holes where they get radicalized into far-right extremism. I understand why that's people's first reaction. Over the past 4 years, the idea of algorithmic radicalization on YouTube has become ubiquitous in headlines, on podcasts, and on TV. And just as ubiquitous has been the metaphor of the rabbit hole, which suggests that YouTube's algorithms figuratively transport users from one part of the platform to the deep, dark corners where racism festers and thrives. Academics, researchers, and journalists alike have taken up the issue with enthusiasm and urgency. So a lot of recent research, pieces of journalism, investigative reports, and so on have been guided by the question, is the YouTube algorithm radicalizing people to the far right? Or another version of that question is the YouTube algorithm leading people down far right rabbit holes? At least within journalism and in popular media, the consensus has been a resounding yes. And on the left hand here, we see Zeynep Tufekci, who Gerald had mentioned, who's an incredible scholar and whose work I respect immensely and has helped shape my thinking. Although in this case, I disagree a bit with her interpretation of the problem. She wrote in an influential column in the New York Times in 2018 that YouTube's business model leads the platform to attempt to keep users on the platform at all costs, and that as a result, recommendation algorithms feed users increasingly extreme videos over time to keep their interest peaked. And the idea of this theory kind of proposes that this inches viewers towards more and more radical viewpoints over time. So kind of piece by piece, people get fed more and more radical content and extremist content, and they adopt it bit by bit. And on the right-hand side here, we have the work of the tech journalist Kevin Roose, who also lent support to this theory in his in-depth profile of a young man named Caleb Kane, who found himself adopting far-right ideas after watching a large amount of YouTube. In a follow-up podcast about YouTube, the New York Times leaned especially heavily on this rabbit hole metaphor, using that name, rabbit hole, as the name of the podcast, and titling individual episodes things like Wonderland and Looking Down. Academic findings have been a bit more mixed, but they've continued to focus on the impact of the algorithm, asking whether or not it draws people down into these deep, dark corners of the platform. So today, I'm not going to argue one way or the other as it relates to that question. I'm actually going to argue that this entire framework for how this question is posed is not the most productive way to understand how disinformation, conspiracy theories, and white supremacist content spread on YouTube and online more generally. And I'm going to argue that frequently it's more productive to think about the amplification of content through algorithms and celebrities than thinking about users going down a rabbit hole. And I'll kind of explain much more in depth what I mean by all of that. But to start things off, I just want to take a little bit of a closer look at this metaphor of the rabbit hole and basically ask, like, why do we use this to help shape how we feel about extremist content online and how we think about it, and what assumptions are baked into this. And that may seem like an overly abstract or frivolous exercise, but I actually think it's fundamental to the way we think about political media online. In their classic work on the power of metaphors, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson argued that metaphors not only reflect our understanding of reality, but they also help construct it. So in other words, the metaphors that we choose to use actually shape how we think about certain phenomena. And I argue that the rabbit hole metaphor of radicalization is no different. As I'm sure many here know, the metaphor of the rabbit hole originates from Lewis Carroll's book, Alice in Wonderland, which was published in 1865. In the fantasy book, the protagonist Alice falls down a literal rabbit hole and finds the strange and fantastical world of Wonderland at the other end. The rabbit hole also acts as a symbolic representation of Alice's journey into the strange and uncharted territories of adolescence. Since its original use in this story, the rabbit hole has become this like enduring and flexible metaphor throughout society. And it's been used to reference everything from LSD trips to the Matrix. And it has also played a big role in the way we understand the workings of the internet. When the World Wide Web became a global phenomenon in the 1990s, people began using spatial metaphors to help describe the new technology. And one of the earliest metaphors, for example, was calling the internet the information superhighway, which helped illustrate how the internet facilitates the rapid transmission of messages around the world. I think that metaphor in particular sounds really outdated now because we're used to the internet being a worldwide phenomenon. We don't need that metaphor to help describe how it works. But at the time, it really helped people make sense of the strangeness and newness of the internet, which seemed to operate outside the laws of space and time. By the early 2000s, the internet began to feel less like this vast unmapped territory, and new metaphors emerged that focused more on the internet's presumed depth. So people started thinking, okay, well, we have the internet all around the world. We've got this information scuttling back and forth, but what's lying underneath the surface? And specifically with the proliferation of technologies like Bitcoin and anonymous proxy networks like Tor and Freenet, journalists began referring to things like the deep web, the dark net, and the dark web. So each of these terms actually technically has its own distinct meaning, but the conflation between them led to this kind of unified, messy conception of this internet underworld below the surface of the rest of the internet, where all of the moral violations take place. But those claims have always been way more symbolic than they've been actually accurate. In fact, there's nothing particularly deep or dark about these technologies. Essentially, there's certain browsers that people can use that allow them to conceal their locations and conceal them from the surveillance that we experience day to day on the internet. But that can be used for any range of purposes. So, for example, protesters in authoritarian regimes frequently use the so-called dark web to avoid detection so they can organize democratic resistance, for example. And on the flip side, white supremacists and neo-Nazi movements frequently operate directly on mainstream social media platforms. They don't need to go to the dark web. They don't feel the need to use these tools because, in part, they find it easier to recruit new people in the spaces of the internet where everyone else gathers. When we talk about a YouTube rabbit hole of algorithmic radicalization, we draw on the same tropes and symbolism. We suggest that there's a stable, dark underbelly of YouTube that would largely remain untouched, except that the recommendation algorithm draws in viewers and brings them tumbling down. As a former design ethicist at Google described it, he said, there's a spectrum on YouTube between the calm section, the Walter Cronkite, Carl Sagan part, and Crazy Town, where the extreme stuff is. So that's kind of the precise imagery and symbolism that I want to challenge. Aside from the fact that I'm not sure why this ethicist thinks that normal people are flocking to YouTube for Walter Cronkite and Carl Sagan content, I also think there's some other deeply misleading assumptions baked into this idea. Whoops. There we go. The main thing is the suggestion that there's this normal, good, calm section of YouTube that's easily separated from the crazy town section of YouTube. In reality, when you go in and start researching political content online, you find that it's nearly impossible to draw distinct lines between what counts as mainstream and extreme ideologies, as well as mainstream versus independent media. So to illustrate the difficulties in drawing these distinctions, I want to briefly discuss what's known as the Great Replacement theory. This is traditionally a white nationalist conspiracy theory that asserts that so-called elites, which is often code for Jewish people, are orchestrating the replacement of white citizens of a given country with people of color through immigration and other demographic shifts. So I'm going to read 4 quotes from 4 different men who all promoted strikingly similar versions of the Great Replacement theory in different contexts recently. And by way of warning, these quotes are quite disturbing. The first quote reads, "This is ethnic replacement. This is cultural replacement. This is racial replacement." This was written in the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter, the man who, in 2019, carried out a terrorist attack against Muslims in New Zealand, killing 51 people and injuring another 40. The second quote reads, "We are becoming a displaced minority in our own country thanks to democratic policies. They tax the hell out of middle-class families who might want to have more children while paying for welfare queens to have 5 or 6 babies they can't support." This quote comes from Jason Kessler, a neo-Nazi and white supremacist who was the primary organizer of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. The third quote is, "Deputize a citizen force, put them on the border, give them handcuffs, get it done. Sure, that's dramatic. You know what's dramatic? The invasion of the country. The other side has openly admitted that this is about bringing in voters and decreasing white demographics in America. This quote comes from Charlie Kirk, who's considered a mainstream conservative activist and a founder of the conservative nonprofit organization Turning Point USA, which is considered the dominant force in contemporary campus conservatism. And finally, the last quote I'll read is, "There's an unrelenting stream of immigrants here to change the racial mix of the country, to reduce the political power of people whose ancestors live here, and to dramatically increase the proportions of Americans newly arrived from the third world." And that quote comes from Tucker Carlson, the primetime television host on Fox News, whose show is the most watched cable program in the United States. I'm bringing up these four men not to make any definitive statement about, the current state of the Republican Party and its relationship to white nationalism. And I'm also not trying to claim that these four men hold all the same views on every issue. I'm also not trying to claim that these four men's content should be treated the same by social media platforms. What I am trying to do is use this example to illustrate the genuine methodological challenges that arise when we attempt to draw strict lines between categories when the empirical data doesn't give us any existence that these clear lines exist. In fact, the blurring of these boundaries fundamentally challenges the conception that a person has to be incrementally brought down a rabbit hole by an algorithm to be exposed to extremist or supremacist content. In fact, they don't even have to go on YouTube. While a lot of Fox News clips are indeed posted to YouTube, a person can also find Tucker Carlson by merely turning on their TV. And a college student can find Charlie Kirk and his colleagues leading events on their college campuses. So this is one of many examples that suggest to me that we need to rethink how we approach supremacist content online. And the first way to do that is to acknowledge that extreme beliefs are not always the same thing as fringe beliefs. The scholar of extremism, J.M. Berger, has written about this, warning us not to assume that extremist beliefs cannot also be incredibly mainstream and held by large swaths of people in society. Berger defines extremism as the belief that an in-group's success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against an outgroup. So for example, you can tie that definition to all of the Great Replacement theory quotes I was reading above. All of these four men were suggesting that an influx of immigrants, an increase in birth rates of people of color in the United States, AKA the outgroups, posed a serious threat to the so-called in-group, which is white Americans. And the belief that white Americans can never be separated from, hostile action against these immigrants, against people that they believe are replacing them. So importantly, this definition by J.M. Berger has nothing to do with how close one's politics hew to the center of national discourse. As Berger notes, there have been successful and important historical regimes that were both incredibly widespread in society and extremist. And the two main examples he uses are Nazi Germany and institutionalized racial slavery in the United States. So, given all of these critiques that I'm making, what am I suggesting actually is going on here? If entire swaths of our media landscape are rife with extremist content and ideas, how do we actually make sense of them? So, one approach, and spoiler alert, this is not the approach that I've taken, although I find it quite fascinating. One approach is to take a 50,000-foot view of the overall media landscape and how it has shifted over time. This is the approach that the scholars Yochai Benkler, Robert Ferris, and Hal Roberts at Harvard took in their study of media consumption during the 2016 presidential election. They mapped the media sources that people of different political persuasions shared online, and they found a deeply segmented and asymmetrical landscape. While liberal media consumers, which you can see in blue kind of on the center and left, they were largely sharing what we might call centrist or somewhat liberal news sources, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Politico. But the right-wing internet users were by and large sharing from the openly right-wing Fox News and the far-right source Breitbart. One way to explain this is to think back to J.M. Berger's definition of extremism. If hosts on Fox News like Tucker Carlson are promoting extremist ideas, then there's a problem with the overall structure of our media systems, not just one kind of pesky algorithm on YouTube. So I draw on this research. I find it incredibly helpful in informing what I do. But that said, in my own research, I've tended to look at things on a smaller scale. So I'm not looking at this 50,000 foot view. Instead, I've frequently traced individual conspiracy theories as they spread through the internet, and I track individual media figures over the course of their careers. And time and again, what I find in that research is that, well, some people do find themselves kind of drawn into far-right spaces, subcultures, areas where there are kind of smaller audiences. The much broader issue is that individual conspiracy theories and pieces of propaganda and disinformation get amplified and spread throughout the internet through the power of media figures and celebrities. And although I focus on it less, algorithms can play a role in amplification too. Importantly, this phenomenon I'm describing doesn't fit into the rabbit hole metaphor. When we assume that people get drawn down into rabbit holes of far-right content, we suggest that viewers figuratively move over time and space, but that ideas and channels stay fixed. It's Alice who falls down the rabbit hole, but Wonderland and kind of the above ground England don't move at all. But in reality, on YouTube and around the internet more broadly, ideas and conspiracy theories spread from channel to channel and from social media platform to social media platform. And in this case, YouTubers and other political creators can act as amplifiers of white supremacist content and other extremist ideas. In fact, my earliest research on YouTube focused specifically on the platform as an important amplifier of a conspiracy theory about Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election. The conspiracy theory posited that Hillary Clinton was suffering from life-threatening health problems, but that she and her campaign were involved in a major cover-up to mask these problems from the public. People who believed the theory suggested she was both physically weak and cognitively impaired, suffering from Parkinson's disease, dementia, and/or some seizure attacks. This is a case where we can actually use the term fringe to accurately describe how this conspiracy theory started out. The conspiracy theory, this specific theory, was popular only among a small audience of internet users in July and August of 2016. Many of them kind of trafficked in other conspiracy theories. This was their bread and butter. YouTubers with really small followings would make videos about it that only a small number of people would see. People kind of operating a niche subcultural internet forums would share memes about it. So you can see in the lower left-hand corner here, they would make these compilations showing Hillary Clinton coughing and trying to use that as evidence that she was kind of suffering from a grave illness. That all changed when the influential YouTuber, Paul Joseph Watson, who's in the center here, made a video promoting the conspiracy theory. Watson worked for the well-known conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, and he had a significant following in his own right. He posted a video about the conspiracy theory, promoting it, and I checked it this morning out of curiosity. It's still up on YouTube, and as of today has been viewed over 7 million times. After Watson's video, more conservative news outlets, such as the Drudge Report, began to question the state of Hillary's health, raising questions about her fitness to be president. Perhaps most notably, Fox News primetime host Sean Hannity devoted multiple nights of coverage to questions around Hillary's health. He brought on various medical experts to speculate on the conspiracy theories, and even when they didn't outright endorse these conspiracy theories, frequently they would pose open-ended questions in ways that continued to seed doubt among viewers. Even though my chart doesn't represent this here, or I don't know if you could even call it a chart, my little illustration here, I also want to make clear that the mainstream media, places like CNN, New York Times, and so on, also continued to amplify or feed into this idea more generally, because Fox News has traditionally played a really big role in setting the agenda for what the rest of the media talks about. They may take a different tone or a different approach to stories, but frequently when Fox News starts to focus on stories, other media outlets will focus on the same stories. This was especially tricky in this case because a few weeks after this conspiracy theory began proliferating, Hillary Clinton actually got sick. She came down with a sickness, in the months leading up to the election. And this seemed to confirm for people that, there was something fishy going on, even though she had just caught some sort of bug. As I continued this research with my colleague Alice Marwick, we found that this kind of amplification incident was not an anomaly. And in fact, it happened incredibly frequently. We began to trace the movement of multiple far-right conspiracy theories from media outlets and internet spaces with smaller audiences to those with bigger ones. The case here shows the amplification of a white supremacist conspiracy theory, which promoted the idea that there was a genocide of white farmers taking place in South Africa by Black Africans. It circulated for several years in explicitly far-right spaces, especially the white supremacist forum Stormfront, who uses this logo here in the lower left-hand corner. In 2018, the conspiracy theory got picked up by the YouTuber Lauren Southern, who's second from the left. Southern posted a video and promoted it as a documentary, even though the video was actually promoting the empirically false white genocide theory. Just like Paul Joseph Watson's video, Lauren Southern's video is still currently on YouTube, and it has over 2.6 million views. Her video helped popularize the theory on YouTube and among several other creators on the platform. 2 months later, Tucker Carlson, who had previously spoken favorably about Lauren Southern on his program, began promoting the conspiracy theory on his primetime Fox show. And the same evening as Carlson's broadcast, Trump publicly stated that he had asked Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to closely study the South African land and farm seizures and expropriations. This is a quote by him. The South African land and farm seizures and expropriations and the large-scale killings of farmers. So we can see this process where conspiracy theories start with smaller audiences. They gain much bigger audiences through this process of amplification, and they continue to reinforce extremist ideas incredibly broadly throughout the media ecosystem. So this has led me in my research to ask, why does this amplification happen? Why do YouTubers, TikTokers, Twitch streamers, and even Fox News hosts reinforce and spread conspiracy theories that help contribute to white supremacist viewpoints among their viewers? So there are a lot of answers. It's a really complicated question, of course, but I'm going to focus on one in particular right now, which is that for media creators, a lot of times there are business incentives to do this. So in the past, for a lot of the 20th century, news media were restricted by a legal requirement that their content should serve the public interest. They couldn't broadcast any crazy story that they happened upon if it was disinformation or conspiracy theory that was deemed outside of the public interest or unhealthy to it. Media channels could get punished. So it was far from a perfect system. I mean, there's a lot of history written about how messy this actually was in practice. But I bring that up to contrast the fact that today, individual content creators don't have these restrictions in place, and they're constantly on the hunt trying to maintain and grow their audiences. For people that are, individual YouTubers or individual TikTokers trying to make a living off of this content, they kind of have to, they have to produce content that they see audiences responding to. So this often means that creators will hunt for what they think will be a compelling and entertaining piece of content, even if it doesn't serve the public good. If a particular video or idea proves popular, other creators will jump on board, eager to make a profit on the coattails of others. So that's in part why we see viral trends on YouTube and TikTok. If something has started to prove compelling for viewers, others will jump on board and try to get a piece of the action. And if Fox News hosts see that something's already gaining lots of traction online, they can make the calculus that it will also resonate among their viewers. And because online spaces are so interactive and audiences can give feedback directly to the creators that they watch, audiences may explicitly ask creators to make a piece of content on a particular topic or discussing a particular theory. In this case, creators are essentially getting free market research. And frankly, they would be bad business people not to listen to what their audiences are asking for. This also leads me, whoops, I have been looking at the why. I also want to look at the how of amplification and how it takes place. So conspiracy theories, pieces of disinformation, and propaganda, how exactly do they take hold among viewers at each stage? Because we often treat this kind of content as this natural force that immediately takes hold among viewers, but that's not always the case. Even if a creator sees that a conspiracy theory is making the rounds in a certain subculture, they still need to sell their audience on that idea for it effectively to take hold. And I see this a lot of times, that sometimes creators will kind of dabble in a particular theory or idea and it doesn't take hold, and then they move on to the next thing. But they're kind of always in search for what's going to resonate with their audience, right? So one way I focused on in my research that political content creators are able to kind of do this effective amplification is that they use the same strategies that most content creators use. And that's the strategies of influencers selling to their audiences. So to understand this, let's quickly take a look at a mainstream non-political influencer. This is TikTok's Charli D'Amelio, who I actually am not sure if she's still the most popular TikToker on the platform, but for at least a long time she was, and had upwards, I believe, of 100 million followers, incredibly popular, complete rise to fame very quickly. But she built her popularity by doing these kind of relatively simple TikTok dances. And a lot of the appeal comes from the fact that she builds this sense of intimacy and authenticity with her audience. No matter how genuine that authenticity actually is, right? She's able to present what seems like this authentic glimpse into her life. So she posts from her bedroom, she posts from other parts inside of her house. You can see here she posts in sweatshirts without makeup on, and she gives viewers a sense that they really know her and intimately and can relate to her. Even her dances usually are simple enough that other people can recreate them. So audiences forge this sense of connection with her, and they trust her, and they also get a sense of her likes and dislikes. So this also means that fans of hers know that she is an avid drinker of Dunkin' Donuts and is a genuine fan of that company. So when Charli D'Amelio collaborated with Dunkin' Donuts on her own drink and promoted it, it's continued to seem like this authentic thing to her fans, right? She genuinely loved the company, so it seemed like this natural fit. And likewise, fans who identify with Charli will be able to reinforce that sense of connection when they buy the Charli drink at Dunkin' themselves. A version of this happens with political content creators too. So this is Tim Pool, a YouTuber and live streamer with over 1 million subscribers. In his content, he stresses his relatability to his audience. He wears casual clothes and the trademark beanie hat that you see here. Before eventually creating a studio for producing his content, he used to broadcast from his house, or sometimes, like you can see here, with a handheld camera on the street. He stresses that, like his audience, he's just someone struggling to make sense of the news in these overwhelming and frequently troubling times. Sometimes, like Charli D'Amelio, he uses the trust he's built with his audience to sell products and merchandise. But sometimes he uses that trust to spread conspiracy theories and propaganda, which continue to grow his audience. For example, he was a big promoter of the conspiracy theory that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump and that there was widespread voter fraud throughout. By building trust with his audience through this sense of intimacy and authenticity, he makes certain ideas seem appealing that otherwise might not have taken off. The last part of the how of amplification that I want to briefly mention is that if we're talking about viewers kind of going down rabbit holes, and I'm saying, well, actually, ideas kind of spread around as well, ideas aren't stable. The last thing that I want to mention is that we also can see creators themselves moving around this ecosystem and changing how they feel about views or about the world over time. So you can see, for example, it's incredibly common for YouTubers to collaborate with themselves and also for YouTubers to be invited onto channels like Fox News. So here's Tim Pool again, promoting the idea that technology companies like Twitter and Facebook are systematically discriminating against people like him and his viewpoints. He's been invited onto Fox News. And in this case, Fox News is allowing Tim Pool's ideas to be amplified by literally inviting him onto their channel and giving him access to a much larger audience than he might have otherwise. His audience on YouTube, by the way, is huge. He has over 1 million subscribers, but we don't know exactly the overlap between Fox News audiences and his audiences, but presumably it's not a complete overlap, right? So even though his YouTube audience is very large, this helps him broadcast to perhaps even other viewers that might not have been introduced to his ideas yet. Tim Pool also has adopted further and further right ideas over time. He started out several years ago with a general anti-authoritarian, anti-authority bent, but often kind of promoted ideas like Occupy Wall Street. He would go and broadcast from there. He would look at events happening both on the left and the right. Eventually, over time, he continued to adopt further and further right ideas until he's only essentially promoting conspiracy theories and far-right propaganda. And so what we can see is the entire ecosystem here of media creators on YouTube and outside of it is extremely unstable. But I also think that no matter how unstable, one of the underlying functions here is that these ideas spread, people's fame spreads through this power of amplification. And I think that it's important for us to shift how we think about YouTube and maybe move a little bit away from focusing so much on this rabbit hole metaphor and shift a bit more to thinking about how things spread. They're not just kind of sitting in these dark corners of the internet because they're spreading everywhere. And on that somewhat depressing note, I will leave it at that and shift to the next section of this session. Let's see, stop share.
All right, thanks a lot, Becca. I still find it kind of weird to not hear anything but have to look for applause emojis. So hope you're used to that. I wanted Eileen Pusher to be here today because she has the very special experience, the enviable experience of having to deal with a political celebrity. Did you find anything resonant, Eileen? Maybe you want to tell us a bit about it.
Oh, definitely. Well, thank you, Gerald, and Rebecca Lewis. Thank you so much for elucidating all of this for us, because it's something that I, as a journalism professor here at FAU, certainly watch. But I learned a lot, both from your presentation and from some of your research that I've since read up on. And I think I've been guilty of not taking YouTube seriously enough. And so I greatly appreciate the light that you're shedding on, the influence of YouTube. So while we're all thinking it's about, Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, we're realizing that maybe we've been, treating at least, for those of us who aren't specializing in it, thinking of it, and, with only, a passing interest as kind of, free, entertainment and infotainment. And that sort of thing. I'll say that, in my personal life, I have kids who are 9 and 11, and they're always wanting to watch things on YouTube. And, there are some educational things, they want to do a DIY project, make your own snow globe. But then suddenly you wonder, well, at what point are they going to get pulled down? Now I know not to use the rabbit hole because it's becoming a bit of a cliche and also falls short of what's really happening. But, some of us are really struggling, for those of us here who are parents and, anywhere in the, under 10 or in the teens, figuring out, how to limit the access to that, and to what extent to limit access. What Professor Gerald Sim was referring to in terms of, my personal experience with this, is that in addition to teaching journalism here at FAU, the School of Communication Multimedia Studies, I also do a lot of freelance writing and came to FAU with close to 20 years of experience in journalism. And I wrote a piece for NBC News Think, which is an opinion section of NBC News, after that first disastrous Trump-Biden debate. If you can remember back to then, I was probably around this time of 2020, it was probably around October 2020, where, I think Jake Tapper called it a dumpster fire inside I forget the rest of it, it had some expletives, so I'll leave it aside, but I think you'll remember it. And an editor friend of mine said, would you write a piece about, after what we saw that time, would you let your kids even watch a second one? Because there's supposed to be some kind of civil discourse that happens in a presidential debate, and that's not what's happening here. Maybe I'd made a flippant comment about it on Facebook, and I said, sure, I'll read a piece about that. So it turns out that somehow the column that I wrote, and that would have been, I guess, around a year ago, as I said, last October and November, landed on Rush Limbaugh's desk. And he decided to pan it in his radio show. And, he was, famous for any time he talked about a female professor, he'd call them Professor Et, and kind of, Supreme Court judges were, babes, and, all these sorts of things. And then I got some troubling mail from a few of his fans and listeners. And I can when I'm not speaking, I can share the link if anyone wants to read that piece. But I had that experience of, the kind of enormous power of misinformation, both in terms of that, particular experience and what it could be like, to be on the receiving end of, somebody like a Rush Limbaugh or a Tucker Carlson, calling you out, and what are going to be the repercussions of that for the next month, and the kind of mail you're going to start receiving, and that's almost the kind of the least worrying parts of it. But I'll say, just to kind of tack on to that, of course, one of the things that we're dealing with, we're not out of this pandemic yet, as you all know, and I know that, for example, in this period of time, now I'm teaching all my classes in person again, but most of us were teaching them on Zoom for at least 2 to 3 semesters. And I had a sort of discussion board up where I would throw up, different articles to discuss. And then I thought, let me just leave this one open and tell me your favorite, issue of the week, an article that you came across. And one student used it to share something that would exactly fall along these lines of someone who was kind of, a political YouTuber, spreading misinformation about the pandemic, about the, then being unrolled, unfolded for the public, the vaccines and that sort of thing. And I really struggled with, what should my role be as a professor, not wanting to maybe, make that student feel attacked or singled out by picking apart what he had shared, but, maybe I can share 5 other articles with more or videos if possible, but often, I tend towards the articles, with more credible information. But I had this awareness of how difficult it is, once a video is out and goes viral. Because of your research, Becca, I've been, looking at, some of the people that you mentioned in your research, like Cutie Pie, and, something he just ahead of this panel, I looked at, okay, this video, he just posted it 12 minutes ago and it already had close to 50,000 views on it. So, the impact on this is phenomenal. And I guess I want to say one more thing to loop back to my brush with Rush Limbaugh before, and it was only about, 2 months or so before he passed away. But he was still working, to his credit, I guess, up until the end, is looking at the media landscape and thinking about how much things have changed and how, when Rush Limbaugh was first becoming a radio personality, we still had the fairness doctrine. And I know there are people of a generation who will remember that. And that had a huge impact on the kind of television and radio programming we were exposed to, many of us, when we were growing up. The Reagan administration wanted to get rid of that. It was around 1987 when the FCC said they were no longer going to enforce the fairness doctrine, and that gave a lot of media scholars will say that was kind of the beginning of the end of, like, let's say that when it comes to mass media, we have to have some degree of balance and looking at different perspectives, and some responsibility to truth. All of that said, one can't bring back the fairness doctrine and fix this, right? You can't put that toothpaste back into the tube at this point, because of the internet, because of some of the YouTube is not something that you can sort of perhaps control as easily as one would think. But I think even what we've been seeing, including the testimony that came out just over a week ago, I think it was actually just about a week ago, the Facebook whistleblower, maybe is pointing in a direction towards more regulation that may have an impact. And maybe that's a question that I could kind of throw back towards you, Becca, is to kind of wonder, are there, as you see it, I don't know if you look at that much end of that end of it that much, but do you see either policy changes in the distant or even immediate future that you expect or hope for, in connection to, okay, that's more about the research that we knew that Facebook was doing about Facebook, and in particular about Instagram as opposed to YouTube. But I think it all relates to this kind of massive, what was the information superhighway as it was being described decades ago, has now grown into this kind of many-headed and often unregulated monster. And sometimes we enjoy it when we suddenly need to look something up and it's just right there for us. And there are some good aspects to it. There's a part of me as a free speech advocate who says, there used to be gatekeepers. That chart that you showed and you saw, here's New York Times and Washington Post and CNN. They're still the big influencers, but having more voices and sort of flattening a little bit of the hierarchy. There are some positives in that, but the ugly underside of it is the amplification of voices where there's no editorial board, there's no one to be answerable to. Maybe if you're spreading something that's live, that's actually out and out libel, you could get sued. But beyond that, there's not much control. So I'm curious to ask you, and then I'm curious to ask what any other of our panel people and the participants who are in the group here would think about this. But given your research and what are you advocating or hoping for more regulation of YouTube and other platforms, if you can speak to that, as a way to deal with what we're seeing right now?
Yes, it's such a good question. And before I launch into that, I'll say I'm so sorry you had to deal with kind of getting targeted by Rush Limbaugh. And I, as someone who's been targeted by some of the people I've written about, you see kind of how closely aligned internet harassment is with kind of, political punditry. And that I think is interesting and important as well. But I'll table that for now. I could talk about that for a long time, but yes, certainly I'm sure that was if nothing else, deeply informative experience for you, or at least it has been for myself as well. In terms of the regulation side of it, I'll preface this by saying I'm not a policy scholar by any means. I'm much better at and prefer talking about the problems rather than the solutions, which maybe that makes me just naturally a pessimist. But I also think that, before you can prescribe medicine, you have to correctly diagnose the illness, right? So that's kind of the part of it that I fall in, is trying to correctly diagnose what's going on. And then, saying, okay, we have to center our responses around that. I'm so pleased that you brought up deregulation in the 1990s, 80s and 90s, because I actually think that is where a lot of this starts and comes from. That part of the reason I push back against this, algorithm rabbit hole framing for things is not to say that the algorithm isn't powerful, because it is, and that we shouldn't be understanding it, because we should. But I think it can lead us into this trap of thinking that these problems started with these new technologies, and that it's a purely technological phenomenon. And, in a way that actually ends up kind of minimizing the problem, right? Like, to suggest that the problem is purely the YouTube algorithm is to suggest that the problem of racist content online can be solved by tweaks to the algorithm. And in fact, we know, of course, racism didn't start with the internet. Sexism didn't start with the internet. Bigotry of all kinds have been around long before the internet. The internet has served to exacerbate a lot of it. And so then we have to ask, okay, what exactly was going on before the internet and with the building of the internet? Which parts of it are built into the technology itself? Which parts are due to the deregulation of the internet? And all of that is incredibly important. And so I think, we have to look at, Eileen, as you said, the deregulation in the 80s and 90s is what allowed, first of all, the culture of talk radio to flourish. And second of all, the culture of partisan cable news on TV to flourish. And that changed the landscape so significantly. And to me, that's the beginning of the toothpaste coming out of the tube. The kind of proliferation of this partisan content that came as a result of this deregulation. The internet came about alongside all of these other things, right? And it was a technology built very much with the ideals of kind of deregulation and libertarianism built directly into it. And if you look at the founders of these social media companies and kind of the philosophies they've built into them, it's actually, they try to claim that there's no ideology underpinning what they're doing, that they're these completely neutral actors. And in fact, it's actually a deeply libertarian worldview that's gotten built into these platforms. One where they suggest that actually the way that we should understand free speech, for example, is a highly individualized version of free speech, which, so the understanding of free speech that they use is, every individual should be able to post something without it being taken down. But there are also other ways of thinking about free speech that a lot of First Amendment scholars have written about, which is, for example, to collectively maximize how much everyone in a community can feel like they can share comfortably. You actually have to do some moderation of content or some silencing of certain content to prevent kind of the bullying and harassment and all of these things that end up de facto silencing a lot of people. So I think that regulation has to play a role going forward. As I said, because I'm not a policy person, I tend not to talk about specifics, but I do think that there will need to be some changes. I also think that in the meantime, public pressure is also kind of a deeply important thing to keep kind of public pressure, investigation, journalism, reporting, research, all of these things happening about the platforms, because YouTube actually has made significant changes since 2016, 2017, even 2018. Some of that has been around the algorithm, but a lot of it has been around establishing more clearly their content moderation systems. And that's not to say that they're regulating things more, although sometimes it is. It's also to say that they're getting much more visible and vocal about what kinds of content they are moderating and that they are taking down. I think there's interesting research that shows that actually a lot of conspiracy theorizing can come as a direct reaction to certain content moderation when platforms kind of seem inconsistent in their decision making and don't explain why they're taking certain content down. all of that can kind of ironically lead to more conspiracy theorizing because people feel like they're individually being targeted for their beliefs. And that happens on the right and the left. And so I think that continuing either, public pressure and or regulation that somehow, what I think we need more than anything else is a clear articulation of values and a consistent adherence to those values. Because up until now, what the platforms have been doing is kind of denying that they have any values at all, except for things that sound nice in theory, like, connection, which don't actually mean anything when it comes down to it.
All right, thanks, Becca. So you do have some solutions and a little bit of homework too. But timing is really great. It's time to go to some audience questions. The first one who had a question was my colleague in Film and Media Studies, Chris Robay. So if you want to unmute yourself, Chris.
Thanks, Gerald. Real pleasure listening to you, Becca, and hearing what you have to say. And I do work on social movements on the left and sort of how digital technology intersects. And actually, I'm starting to do work on the right. So it's a real pleasure to hear about your stuff and what you're doing. I really appreciate you, sort of challenging that rabbit hole notion. I also use Roos in my class just because he has that long in-depth reportage, as you mentioned before, because it's really useful for students to sort of get into it. I wanted just to ask you further, you're kind of responding or gesturing towards this way in response to my other great colleague, Eileen. Right. Often the digital and the far right strikes me in the analysis of it as an alibi for not really coming to terms with actually a reckoning of our historic past. It's only it's only shocking that the alt-right or the far right has the traction it does if you don't kind of recognize we're founded on settler colonialism and perpetuate it daily. All of us in South Florida here at FAU are currently occupying stolen land by the Seminoles every single day, and we don't question. We claim we care about diversity, equity, inclusion, and never ask about the indigenous land that we stole and continue to occupy without any kind of repentance. So I'm wondering if you could put it in a much long, I'm a historian too, maybe it shows, but like a much longer kind of historical perspective here, right? The far right is nothing new, genocide and settler colonialism is in our belief system hardcore baked. So I'm wondering if you could expand upon that.
Oh, thank you so much for bringing that up. That is also like a huge pet peeve of mine, or just a huge aspect kind of driving the way that I approach these things. So I'm so glad to have you talk about it and bring it up. I think that talking about using technology as an alibi is such an amazing way of putting it. And I think that's exactly what happens with this rabbit hole metaphor is it allows us to kind of bracket these ideas and treat them as somehow kind of separate from mainstream society. Whereas, when you actually grapple with the history, as you said, that you have to grapple with the fact that our country has historically been a white supremacist country, and that in many ways, institutional white supremacy is still, that's the norm. That's not the deviation, right? And male supremacy and all of these other things. And that gets really tricky to talk about because then you start implicating more mainstream institutions too. And so some of the way that I kind of approach this by starting to inch towards that by showing kind of some of the ways that the rhetoric stays the same and things get amplified. But the tricky thing is I think that on the one hand, you have kind of this like underlying institutional widespread white supremacy. On top of that, you have kind of a political system right now that is becoming more overt in its white supremacy, particularly, in kind of mainstream and less mainstream kind of right-wing media and some of the politicians, but also across the board in many ways. And then on top of that, you do have individual people who become radicalized individually and who, take on different beliefs and change how they see the world. And so it's really difficult to talk about like one level of those things without ignoring the other levels of it. And to me, I think that by only ignoring on kind of these individuals, or excuse me, by only focusing on these individuals who are becoming radicalized, then we kind of come to forget about the institutional history of racism and misogyny and anti-immigration and all of these things in our country's history. And that's really tricky. It's really tricky to grapple with. I know a lot of researchers in this space, myself included, have trouble, figuring out how we want to talk about it. One thing I'll say is that despite kind of, putting Kevin Roos's New York Times article up front as kind of a counterpoint to my own, I actually really love his article. The one part I don't love about it is the rabbit hole framing, but the thing that's interesting to me is when you actually look at this story that he's telling, it's of a young boy that dropped out of college and was having a really tough time and was struggling, and came to become really attached to certain celebrities on YouTube, and they changed his worldview for a long time. So actually, I think that the framing I disagree with, but the actual details of the story that he's telling, which I think he tells incredibly effectively, I think actually point to the power of this celebrity culture and to the pervasiveness of white supremacy on the platform, and to the fact that it's a human problem. It's not just a technology program, or excuse me, not just a technology problem. I think that in general, with the rabbit hole metaphor, despite my kind of like using that as my cause that I'm working against, I think that what's effective about that metaphor is that it effectively helps describe the mental process that happens for people who are becoming radicalized. And in fact, it's really interesting that a lot of white supremacists themselves discuss things in terms of having gone down the rabbit hole. So you'll hear QAnon, for example, they have a whole set of imagery they use around the white rabbit and say, go down the rabbit hole or listen to the white rabbit, all of these different things that they've embraced that. And I actually have like a whole thing that I'm writing up that I thought was too far afield for this presentation, but it's actually about the history of how that metaphor got taken up by people using hallucinogenic drugs in the 60s, and then have since gotten taken up by this weird part of the right that's known as like the psychedelic right. So the people that saw like the QAnon shaman at the January 6th events, he's like deeply into like psychedelics and talks about like how they helped his radicalization process. But I think the mistake is when we conflate kind of what that mental experience is with how the media landscape is structured. And just because someone feels like they're going down this rabbit hole, it doesn't mean that that's actually the way that the media is structured, nor white supremacy in our society. And so that's one of the ways I've tried to tease it out. But I am excited to see your work on the right as you continue to delve into it. And thanks for that question as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becca. Next up, Carson Williams had a question.
Yes, thank you. I first wanted to say thank you for doing this event, and I really appreciated in your presentation the focus on the intersection between online politics and how it bleeds into the real world. And it got me thinking. I know you talked a little bit about like policy prescriptions, and you said that it's not really your forte, but I was wondering, is there even more to like sort of addressing the problem? Like, is it even just the government or just the platform's responsibilities to fight back? And I'd like to pose this question: is there any responsibility for the political left in America to push back in their own way? And if they already are, how are they doing so?
Oh, these are all such great questions. So I will maybe slightly get around your question by, rather than saying should they, I'll talk about how the political left has and hasn't in some degree, and what challenges lie ahead if the political left continues to want to tackle these things. I guess, to answer your question a little bit more head on, I will say I think that to a certain extent, it is the public at large's responsibility. I mean, particularly the platforms and our elected officials. But I also think because public pressure can have an impact, that it's everyone's responsibility to a certain extent. So I certainly would say that yes, I think that it's something that's very important for the political left to be thinking about as well. A few follow-ups to that. Looking at how people on the left have engaged with this is really interesting, I think, and shows a lot of the opportunities and pitfalls. So one of the main ways that certain people on the left have grappled with this is that throughout the past, 4 or 5 years, there's been kind of a wave of left-wing YouTubers that have cropped up specifically to criticize and counter what they see as these far-right white supremacist YouTubers. And a lot of their videos are focused on kind of, debunking various far-right talking points. And in some cases, they may even go on to the channel or a live stream of a far-right content creator and engage with them and their audience directly in a debate. The potential advantage of this is that it kind of helps people break out of potentially whatever bubble or propaganda cycle that they're in and get confronted with new ideas, right? And if a left-wing person or even someone who's just not a far-right person kind of comes in and kind of skewers a far-right person in a debate, then people start to question things, right? So this is actually how Caleb Kane, the focus of the New York Times story, he attributes his de-radicalization to the fact that there were 2 YouTubers, one goes by the name ContraPoints, and one goes by the name Destiny, and these 2 YouTubers would kind of engage in debates with these far-right YouTubers, and at a certain point he said to himself, kind of like, oh, I guess that actually these 2 have a point. And then eventually he went and checked out their content, and then all of that, through that, he started getting de-radicalized. And so that has a lot of promise, absolutely. I think that also has a lot of challenges and pitfalls because kind of one of the pervasive problems here is that what the platforms have created is this environment where so much of the discourse in our public sphere is happening in a commercialized environment where every piece of content is monetizable and potentially kind of this commodity that platforms can use to advertise to their viewers. And so you also get YouTubers who kind of claim to be on a path to de-radicalize people, and so kind of welcome in far-right people into their channel with the goal of like, oh, I'm trying to de-radicalize them, but then they find that it's really great entertainment to just continue to butt heads, and it becomes kind of this like pro wrestling thing where it's more performance than actual engaged debate. Or where people end up actually, finding themselves tilting more to the right than drawing other people to the left. Strange things happen in these environments, and particularly when they're monetized and the goal kind of above all else is to make money and to make a living with it. It doesn't always make for the best de-radicalization. So I'm thinking particularly here of a YouTuber who goes by the name Vosh, who is really controversial, I think, within the left because he kind of claims to be on the left. And the way that he tries to bring in kind of these disillusioned young men is by kind of using this edgy humor and shock humor that sometimes is offensive in itself. And he also has welcomed in certain kind of right-wing figures and far-right figures to be on his channel, sometimes to debate them, but sometimes it's a little bit more friendlier than debate. And so the lines become really blurry really quickly. And I think that in general is the biggest challenge that all of us have, is that we're trying to have these conversations about the platforms and how the platforms work within the confines of how the platforms structure our conversation and our criticism. So when you post on Twitter about how bad Twitter is, that's still a monetized piece of content that Twitter is kind of feeding into, show other people. And the left has its own content creators, and I've been kind of startled, although maybe I shouldn't be, but I should say I've been struck by how little the left has actually critiqued kind of the way that the business interests of these platforms shape the way that discourse happens on them. And so I think that really has hampered the left's ability to kind of meaningfully critique what's happening.
Thanks, Becca. I really admire how much you know about what's on YouTube and what's out there, but I don't envy the work that you had to put in to get there. But Nico Gassanetti, my colleague in English, had the next question. You want?
I do. I don't even think I know what question I want to ask yet. I have so many of like things, and I'm like, you just like barely mentioned this. I feel like I could just talk to you for 6 hours. I actually want to defer my question to more student questions, if that's okay, and I could put it off just because I saw one of my students ask a question right after me, so I'd like to give them the chance first, if that's okay. He wrote it in the chat.
Sure. That student seems to be Nobel Diaz.
Yep.
Who asks, what ways do you think platforms like YouTube, Facebook, etc., can help stop the spread of political misinformation on their platforms? It seems like it would be tricky for a platform to monitor something like that.
Yes, great question. It's super, super tricky. And I do not envy them as much as I criticize the platforms a lot. I think that, they're in a really tough position as they try to figure out where to go from this. And I think that a lot of what I was outlining in terms of this process of amplification, where people kind of take smaller conspiracy theories and kind of make them incredibly widespread, the challenge, one of many challenges that platforms face, is that this starts to implicate really quickly kind of mainstream political candidates and mainstream political parties. And all of these platforms have kind of been able to become so big in part by positioning themselves as non-political and claiming we don't have any political allegiances. And the minute that people start to put pressure on them and feeling like, you're discriminating against this viewpoint, you're discriminating against this viewpoint, you're silencing this viewpoint, they then are forced to kind of grapple with the fact that, okay, we can't really be non-political, right? That one has to inherently take certain stances or at least express certain values in what's allowed on a platform or not allowed on a platform. And that those are inherently going to have some political dimensions. The platforms like to pretend that they don't take any content down, that they don't kind of moderate their content very much, that they're kind of this free for all. And there is some truth to that, but in reality, kind of, they've always taken down huge amounts of content. And I think, for example, many mainstream platforms have taken really strong stances against porn. All of them have taken strong stances against child pornography because that has legal implications for them. But even beyond that, some platforms do allow porn on them and others don't. That's a political decision that they've made. It's not as controversial as some other political decisions, or at least hasn't gotten as much backlash as some of the other ones would, but it's a decision that they've made. They're expressing a value there. They're in a position where they don't feel like they can express other values because they feel like to come out too strongly against this sort of, white supremacist content or, particular political ideas would be kind of partisan in some way, which it kind of gets into this kind of, vicious feedback loop where nothing really gets done. So I think that like the first hurdle is really getting platforms to articulate some sense of coherent values. And until kind of we get that from them, it's going to be an inconsistent hodgepodge of, trying to piece together things that aren't controversial, but still kind of keep their platforms usable. So that's the first part. Then on top of that, there's actually the challenge that comes with implementing whatever their values and policies are supposed to be. So they have to write up their policies and then they have to actually execute on those policies. And that's a really difficult task as well, because of just the pure amount of content. And so they actually, when we talk about the YouTube algorithm, there's actually tons and tons and tons of algorithms that YouTube is using, some of which are determining which content should get taken down and which content should have advertisements removed from it, what they call getting demonetized. And those algorithms are really blunt tools. They use a lot of keywords. No one's exactly sure how and why they work. They're really confusing to people. Since more recently, I've been working on a project that's about so-called cancel culture on YouTube, and I interviewed several actual content creators who operate kind of these like gossip blog channels on YouTube, and they all talked about how, they're not making kind of overtly political content, and they almost all of them had some piece of content removed or demonetized by YouTube, and they all expressed how incredibly panic-inducing and anxiety-producing that can be, because they're trying to make a living off of YouTube content. And when an algorithm kind of, knocks off a video, it often doesn't explain why they've taken down that video. And so people don't even know what they should do differently going forward. In some cases, there are humans that actually sit and review the content, although they can't possibly do all of that. But a lot of really powerful journalistic reporting has shown that the conditions that those workers have to work in is really horrible. They're exposed to deeply traumatizing content. They frequently don't have good labor protection or mental health services provided to them. And so I think that these are all things that kind of need to, we need to focus at them at each stage to really see kind of how platforms can grapple with this. So this is kind of like, not how, I think not how people might expect like an answer to that question to go, but I would say that one really important action for platforms to take in terms of content moderation is to hire content moderators as full-time employees rather than contractors, and to give them insurance and benefits, because that's going to actually incentivize them to it will make them not have as hard or as traumatic a time at their job, right? It will give them some stability and they'll be able to actually take that quite seriously. But the platforms don't have the incentive to do that right now, because adding kind of this major workforce is an expense. It's not bringing in revenue. They want to hire people kind of that are on the sales side and bringing in advertising and all of that stuff. This isn't really the sexy side of the business. But I think that that's one of the most crucial aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, content moderation is hard, but the thing is that their intellectual humility is very selective, right? Some things, they can solve, tech can solve, like COVID, right? They'll say that, but you can't content moderate. Anyway.
Richard Pereira, no, it's true.
Richard Pereira had the next question, and it is, why is it important for people to understand the impact and influence of political celebrities or celebrities in general, and what they have with their massive outreach? Like, what's the major takeaway, do you think, people in general should have from your work?
A surprisingly difficult question, but I think that a lot of what I have ended up trying to do with my work is suggest that some of the directions that policy conversations and response conversations have gone are not actually the most effective way to go with things. So one of the main cases of this is time and time again, I see that kind of responses to the disinformation crisis focus on, we need more fact checking. We need more fact checking, just present people with the facts, and that necessarily will like clean up our information environment. And, you know, I can't speak to every environment, and that may be effective in other environments. On YouTube and among YouTube celebrities, that is going to have little to no impact. In part because, like I was talking about with these political celebrities, they introduce things through these authentic, you know, trying to be authentic and intimate. And so the way that they talk about these concepts is often through kind of personal narratives and personal storytelling about, here's how I came to adopt the views that I have. And in some ways, they even adopt the language, whether it's conscious or not, of kind of like brand testimonials or product testimonials. They'll say like, ever since I became a white nationalist, my life has been so much better. I met my husband that way. You know, I see the world as it really is. I'm relieved. All of these things. You can't really come from the outside and fact check that. I mean, maybe, you know, unless you can go in and find that that's not actually how they met their husband, right? But for the most part, they're actually telling the truth about their personal journeys. And that's partly what's so powerful about it, and also why it's incredibly resistant to fact checking. Conspiracy theories more generally are notoriously like quite impossible to fact check, because what they do is form this closed loop world and reasoning, which any fact that you present to them gets folded in as an example of just how deeply brainwashed you've been by the mainstream or by the cover up. And so there's a way that kind of they become completely insulated from any fact checking efforts. And I also think that it, you know, we need to understand kind of the deeply social and kind of people oriented sense of how this works. I mean, you know, going back to talking about history, if you read about the KKK from the 1920s, the way that they kind of recruited new members is actually remarkably similar to the way that kind of far right groups recruit new members today. The far right has the internet at their disposal now, but they've always jumped on new technologies. You know, in the 1920s, the KKK was using radio and newspapers, and they also were using kind of local film screenings. They would have people gather at a local church and kind of watch a movie together. And what happens for a lot of people is that the social comes first and the political ideas come second. And so once you're kind of brought into this social network and community where everyone believes the same things, then you can more easily kind of come to adopt it. And I think celebrity culture on social media is important because it's kind of allowing for that to happen at kind of a broadcast scale, right? You kind of come to feel like you're friends with a celebrity, even with the knowledge that you actually don't know them. There's still that sense of social connection there.
Oh, thanks. Any final questions for Becca? If not, I'll add something brief. I'll go back to the popularity of the algorithmic radicalization narrative, right? Mm-hmm. Like, to what extent do you think that is a reaction to techno-chauvinism, just the attitude that tech can solve everything, right? So the response is, well, let's counter that narrative. And so this is the only thing we have to fix.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And absolutely, I think that's a big part of it. That, you know, if you look at kind of media discourse over the course of the 2000s, it was incredibly techno-chauvinist, and there was techno-optimism, right? This idea of, the internet is going to solve racism. It's going to solve sexism. You know, there was this idea with all of these kind of democratic uprisings happening around the world of, the social media is going to spread democracy around the world. And that's like an incredibly potent message to believe in. And even though there were already, you know, a ton of problems going on, I think that for a lot of people, to a certain extent, myself included, who the 2016 election was a wake-up call. And so suddenly everyone was searching for kind of explanations of, how did this happen? And it's so easy to kind of then invert that message that people have been hearing for several years and say, no, actually tech is ruining society. It's ruining democracy and all of these things. And, it's tough because I don't want to let these platforms off the hook. I think that they have incredible power, and that they have kind of exacerbated a lot of these issues, and that they've created media environments that we really have to grapple with now. But I also think that as I mentioned, tech didn't create these problems, and it's not going to solve them alone. We have to work on solutions that are technical alongside, social and kind of political.
Thanks. And we're at almost at 5:30. So, but before we adjourn, Becca, can you tell us a little bit? Tell us what you're reading right now, and tell us how people can find you online.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now I'm in the process of, I talked a lot today about profit motives and kind of the business model of these platforms and the role that that's played. Right now I'm actually going back, doing historical research, if 2010 to 2014 counts as historical, and looking actually at the role that right-wing foundations and nonprofits have played online. So actually a little bit outside of the profit motive, but there are a lot of kind of nonprofit organizations that have played a really big role in the online information ecosystem. So I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with like Prager University, it's called. It's a major YouTube channel that has a lot of people on it that are individuals who kind of are driven by the profit motives of YouTube, but PragerU itself is a nonprofit organization. So I'm going back and looking at the history of that a little bit and trying to grapple with the role that nonprofits have played too, which maybe it doesn't sound like the most exciting thing in the world, but I think it's going to be super interesting. So fingers crossed. And where people can reach me, my website is beccalou.org. Here, I'll type it right here. And you can also find me on Twitter at beccalou. And if anyone has any further questions, you can find my email on the website. You can tweet at me. Happy to keep the conversation going.
Well, that's pretty easy to remember, and people call that brand consistency. Right? And with that, let's all give a couple of flash Becca some emojis if you want.
Thank you all so much for coming and sticking around.
Thank you for everybody for coming, and thanks Becca for coming.
Excellent. Thank you.